Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. As I am recording this, it is Thursday, Poetry Thursday, and my jumping off point is a video done by booktuber Grix, G-R-I-X at Grix, etc. He read a poem by Seamus Heaney. I'm not sure the correct way to pronounce that author's name. He's not a poet that I particularly like. I will read the same poem which Grix read. Grix apologized for his accent, perhaps, in reading the poem, English not being his native language. He did a fine reading of the poem. In my case, I have to apologize for my complete and utter lack of sympathy with the poet. But this is not in any sense an attempt to upstage Grix. My real focus is not with that particular poem, but I will read the poem by Heaney. Anything can happen, and it purports to be a translation from the Latin of Horace. I have that with me as well. Well, not the Latin, I have another translation. A couple of translations. Anything Can Happen is the title. Anything can happen. You know how Jupiter will mostly wait for clouds to gather head before he hurls the lightning. Well, just now he galloped his thunder cart and his horses across a clear blue sky. It shook the earth and the clogged under earth, the river Styx, the winding streams, the Atlantic shore itself. Anything can happen. The tallest towers be overturned, those in high places daunted, those overlooked regarded. Stropped beak fortune swoops, making the air gasp, tearing the crest off one, setting it down bleeding on the next. Ground gives. The heavens wait, lifts up off Atlas like a kettle lid. Capstones shift, nothing resettles right. Telluric ash and fire spores boil away. I am not sure what the phrase stropped beak fortune means. Stropped is a word I don't know, so my apologies, I have not looked it up. Grix said something to the effect that he believes the poem was written in some kind of a response to the events of September 11th, 2001, the taking down by terrorists of the World Trade Center towers. It was a shocking event for people alive at the time. The politics of it transformed the United States because what had been a crime was treated as an act of war, and then that led to a whole series of ramifications which spun out of control. So, just to give you the sense of a translation that I like, not as a translation, let me clarify, but just as a poem. This poem speaks to me. I am sure that the one by Heaney will speak to you, at least any of my contemporaries. How it goes for future generations, I could not say, not that I expect them to be watching this video. But this is a poem speaking not for the accuracy of the translation, but the language speaks to me. This by John Connington. My prayers were scant, my offerings few, while witless wisdom fooled my mind. But now I trim my sails anew, and trace the course I left behind. For lo, the sire of heaven on high, by whose fierce bolts the clouds are riven, today through an unclouded sky, his thundering steeds and car has driven. E'en now dull earth and wandering floods, and Atlas's limitary range, and Styx and Taenarus's dark abodes are reeling. He can lowliest change and loftiest, bring the mighty down and lift the weak. With whirring flight comes fortune, plucks the monarch's crown, and decks therewith some meaner wight. A little bit dated in some of the language, but if you've read any of my poems, you know that I have no qualms with words that have gone out of fashion. One never knows, they might come back in fashion. The real purpose of this is to direct your attention to an essay written by Sven Birkerts, published on October 1st, almost immediately after the incident, talking about the prevalence of a poem by W.H. Auden, which seemed to be everywhere at the time. People were drawing upon Auden's poem for solace. I'm not going to read the poem, but I would like to read something that Birkerts wrote in Observer. It's kind of hard to find, and it may well turn out to be the best thing Birkerts ever wrote. At the time, he was a very important writer for me. I had read his Gutenberg elegies, and he had a book titled Writings, which I absolutely adored, at least the first half of. And recently I came across it, and it does not hold up for me, sadly to say. I must have the Gutenberg elegies somewhere, and I should take a look at that and see how I feel. He was much interested in the effects of digital technology, I suppose we would say, upon writing. And all of his prognostications and worries, and admonitions, and so forth have probably well been superseded. So that might make his books on such subjects dated a little bit. But this essay, dealing with the calamity of that day and its impact upon the nation as a whole, is really something marvelous. The title was Disaster Calls Poetry to Action. Auden's verses are back at work. So that's, if you want to find it, you can Google it with that. You may recall that poet Billy Collins famously said that he would never write a poem touching upon the subject. He later backtracked upon that statement and wrote a poem which I think suited the occasion quite adequately. I don't know what he had been afraid of, but I was glad that he revisited the theme, or visited the theme for the first time. But he had taken a lot of flack for having said that he would never write a poem that dealt with the coming down of those towers. So, with poets such as Billy Collins opting out, people naturally went to the best sources that they could find. And that best source was a poem by W.H. Auden, September 1, 1939. You can easily find it online. In fact, if I have done a recording of it, I will put a link to that in the description. I must have done. You will not find it in his collected poems. So this is what Sven Birkerts wrote probably within 3 weeks of the incident. Disaster calls poetry to action. Auden's verses are back at work. By Sven Birkerts, 10/1/2001. I teach 2 writing colleges at Mount Holyoke College, normally an orderly drill in which I try to supply useful strategies for a series of expressive tasks. But, of course, normally vaporized this year as soon as the semester began, and I found myself, like every teacher in the country, faced with the question of how to proceed with my course, the premises of my subject, in the face of a collective sadness and unease unlike anything I've ever experienced. Meeting my creative writing class last week for the first time since the disaster, I brought in copies of W.H. Auden's September 1, 1939, a poem that's been everywhere in the air these last days. I thought that if my students didn't know it, they should. And as I was reading out the later lines of the opening stanza, waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. I thought I felt an attentiveness in the room that went beyond the usual open-eyed, if sometimes undiscriminating, receptivity. I had the sense that the words, to paraphrase a line from another Auden poem, were hurting and connecting. We did not go on, as I thought we might, to talk about the poem. Instead, somehow we got onto the question of the place of poetry, and by extension, literature, in the face of the unspeakable. Why read or study it? What does it give us? Can words arranged on a page make a difference? Of course, I had to cite T.W. Adorno's famous dictum, "No poetry after Auschwitz." What could that mean? Expressions around the room were mostly baffled. I wanted to break the question down. Did Adorno mean no poetry because we should not write it? Because the writing of poems celebrated the human in ways that had become unconscionable? Or because the assertion of purpose and inner coherence that poetry necessarily represents was somehow wrong, no longer viable? Or did Adorno mean no poetry because we could not, because an extreme of barbarism had revealed language to be inadequate, limited in what it could represent, because barbarism had thus undermined the core assumption of the enterprise? But why single out poetry? Everything is ultimately limited. One might as well mark the enormity of moral devastation by insisting no anything, which becomes, of course, a paper argument carried on in the face of human contrariness, the biological persistence that will rebuild the world no matter how many times it's torn apart. The argument about the writing and reading of poetry is also finally academic. No poetry after Auschwitz, except that there was and there is. Akhmatova, Milosh, Bishop, Brodsky, Haney, Lowell, Walcott, Plath, Herbert, and thousands of others. Poetry has flourished since the time of the death camps, and not because it has looked away. It hasn't. Problem solved. Except, alas, that it continued to vex, as it must now that the world has been torn apart again. Must, for asking the question is a way of addressing the pain, the very real sense of hopelessness that floods me over and over throughout the day. What is the place, the purpose of poetry? I was asking it again that afternoon as I blazed my way east on the Mass Pike, lost in a thought fugue rare even for me, who am given to thought fugues on these long commutes. And by the time I reached the outskirts of Boston, I had a kind of answer. It took a while to get there. My first thought, contra Adorno, was that disaster requires poetry precisely because of the implied perspective all literature, assumes. The seriousness and ongoing point of all things, however fragile the web of meaning may seem at times. And because poetry springs directly from our primal need and capacity for communication. As I'd just declaimed to my class from Auden. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. But then I had another, less expected idea. To understand the use of poetry, its particular importance in times like this, I realized we need to understand the nature of trauma. This is a subject for deep study, of course, but a few generalizations are possible. To begin with, catastrophic trauma shatters norms. It upsets, in a way that feels permanent, the balance of things. It overwhelms our psychic system, melting down the usual response mechanisms whereby experiences are organized and stored as the stuff of memory. Further, this trauma creates for itself a kind of perpetual present. What is post-traumatic stress disorder but the psyche's inability to banish hurt to the past? In the sufferer, and we are now all to some degree sufferers, the pain stays alive, there to be activated at any moment. The plane keeps slicing into the building, each time fresh. It doesn't stop. We don't even need to see the loop anymore. And this, I thought, is where poetry comes in. Poetry does not, with its meanings and messages, defeat trauma. It does not argue it away with its countervailing sense of purpose. Nothing so simple. Poetry works on a deeper level because it mobilizes such a concentration of devices, such an intensification of language via rhythm, syntax, image, and metaphor, reading it, the best of it, can create another, very different kind of perpetual present, an awareness that can be as ongoing in the soul as the stop time of trauma. For poetry is the reverse of the terrorist act, its antithesis, just as the terrorist act is the complete negation of the spirit of poetry. We read poetry because we need something to hold against horror, something to place alongside it that is equally persistent. Not because poetry overturns or disarms horror, but because it helps restore the delicate inner balance we call sanity. And when this balance, this instinctive sense of moral proportion, is threatened, as it is now, we need poetry in the worst way. Shakespeare asked, "How with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower?" A rhetorical question. He knew, as did Auden, who in that most sustaining poem, with a modesty that seems to me just slightly disingenuous, wrote, "All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die." Auden would not allow that poem to be reprinted in his collected poems, arguing that "we must love one another or die" was misleading, a false choice. I've always wondered where this sudden literalism came from, this misplaced sense of scruple. It's his best line. So that was the piece by Sven Birkerts, which I think holds up today, now that many people are living who were born well after the events of that fateful day. So going back to the poem by Horace, I do happen to have some Horace, and I thought I would read a final version, translation by James Michie, Michie, and it, I assume none of these are trying to be literal translations. This one adds 2 extra stanzas in contrast to the Haney and the other fellows whose name is hard for me to remember. I'm not reading this last because I particularly think it's a great rendition, but it's a different one, and I thought I would just cap off this with that. He titles it Parcus Deorum Cultor et Infrequens, which I assume comes from Horace. I, who have never been a generous or a keen friend of the gods, must now confess myself professor in pure foolishness, and driven by sheer force of proof to alter course, must shift my sails and voyage back to think again upon a different tack. For Jove, who usually throws a lightning flash that goes glittering through intervening cloud, this morning hurtled with his thunder loud, chariot and horses through a sky entirely blue. The brute earth and its restless waters, Styx and the hateful underworld's grim quarters, even the last known land where Atlas takes his stand, staggered. I see then that God can change high and low. The unregarded man steps up, the proud backs down. Here fortune sets a crown, and there upon her noisy wing she swoops to dispossess another king. The day that the airplanes struck those towers, you may recall, was a beautiful, brilliant, sunny Tuesday. Thank you for stopping by my channel.